Imagine a city where the streets are so narrow that sometimes you could reach out and touch the buildings on either side. In this city, Paris, the year is 1357, and life is a blend of beauty and brutality. Picture this: the sun sets, and the curfew bell rings, signaling the end of the day. Shops close, and the city falls silent. But in the shadows, something far more sinister lurks. Brigands and mercenaries, known as the Free Companies, roam the countryside, burning and pillaging everything in their path. This is the world of medieval Paris, a place where nobles and commoners alike struggle to survive in a time of chaos and change. Paris in the 14th century was a bustling city, but it was far from the modern metropolis we know today. Water was a precious resource, supplied to the city through aqueducts that led from the hills northeast of Paris. Public fountains were the primary source of water for the citizens, and they were a central part of daily life. Windmills dotted the outskirts of the city, known as faubourgs, where houses had room for gardens and vineyards. Abbeys stood amid cultivated fields, and the produce from these fields was brought into the city by riverboat. Market tables were set up, and vendors sold their goods from trays, creating a vibrant and colorful scene. Beggars sat by church doors asking for alms, while mendicant friars roamed the streets, begging for bread for their orders and for the poor in prison. Jongleurs, a type of medieval entertainer, performed stunts and magic in the plazas, reciting satiric tales and narrative ballads of adventure in far-off lands. The streets were bright with colored clothes, crimson, green, and particolored being the most expensive, reserved for nobles, prelates, and magnates. The clergy could wear color, but their gowns had to be long and buttoned. As sundown approached, the curfew bell rang and the city began to wind down. Work ceased, shops were shuttered, and the bustling atmosphere gave way to silence. At 8 o'clock, the Angelus bell signaled bedtime, and the city was plunged into darkness, with only the crossroads lit by flickering candles or lamps placed in niches holding statues of Notre Dame or the patron saint of the quarter. On Sundays, all business was closed, and everyone went to church. Afterward, working people gathered in taverns, while the more affluent citizens, or bourgeois, promenaded in the faubourgs. On holidays, it was a Parisian custom to dine at a table set outside the front door. The houses in Paris were characteristic of the high, narrow urban type, built side by side, sometimes with a courtyard between the front half and the back. They were half-timbered, with the spaces filled by clay or stone, and each story cantilevered over the one below. The homes of nobles and magnates retained some elements of fortified castles, with conical towers and high walls. These homes had large glass-paned windows opening onto courtyards and ornamental pinnacles on the roofs, from which a watch could be maintained on all sides. The owner's coat of arms was often sculpted over the doorway, marking the residence. Indoors, the noble residences were decorated with murals and tapestries, but furniture was sparse. Beds, which served for both sitting and sleeping, were the most important item. Chairs were few, and even kings and popes received ambassadors while seated on beds adorned with elaborate curtains and spreads. Otherwise, people sat on benches. Torches in wall sconces provided light, and massive fireplaces were built into the walls. These fireplaces, known as wall chimneys in the French fashion, were a luxury in middle-class homes. The only other sources of warmth came from the oven and cooking fire, and warming pans used in bed at night. Sanitation and heating were basic, and people relied on fur coverlets, fur-lined clothes, or separate fur linings worn under tunics and robes to stay warm. The floors were strewn with fragrant herbs and grasses in the summer, and rushes or straw in other seasons, changed 4 times a year or less frequently in poorer homes. Wealthier merchants would scatter violets and other flowers on their floors before dinner parties, and decorate their walls and tables with fresh greens bought from the market. Privacy was a luxury in these homes. Servants slept wherever they could, and even in the homes of the wealthy, guests often shared rooms with the host and hostess. This lack of privacy may have increased irritability, but it also facilitated close relationships, both friendly and romantic. For example, in Chaucer's Reeve's Tale, 2 Cambridge students were able to enjoy the favors of the miller's wife and daughter because they were all put to bed in the same room. This was the world of the Third Estate in Paris, ranging from the poorest workman to the richest magnate. Étienne Marcel, the Provost of Paris, tried to mobilize this diverse group in his struggle against the Dauphin, the heir to the throne. Marcel used the threat of strikes and popular violence to force the Dauphin to submit. When the Dauphin attempted to raise money by devaluing the coinage, Marcel ordered all guilds and trades to stop work and arm themselves. The Dauphin was forced to cancel the edicts and recall the estates to meet with him. At this session, which lasted from February to March 1357, all proposed reforms were presented in a Grand Ordinance of 61 articles. This document, written in French rather than Latin, was a Magna Carta of the Third Estate. It set forth an ideal of good government and outlined a series of corrections to existing abuses. The ordinance provided that the monarchy could levy no tax without the approval of the estates, that the Estates General had the right to assemble periodically at their own volition, and that a Grand Council of 36, with 12 members from each estate, was to be elected by the estates to advise the crown. The ordinance also included provisions for reducing royal and princely expenditures, speeding up judicial cases, preventing nobles from leaving the country without permission, and forbidding private wars. Justice and charity for the poor were to be expedited, and the right of villagers to assemble and take arms against robbery and force was affirmed. Finally, the estates undertook to raise taxes sufficient to pay 30,000 soldiers for 1 year. But the money was to be administered by the estates, not the crown. The Dauphin resisted and procrastinated, but Marcel's use of popular violence eventually forced him to sign the ordinance. However, the Dauphin's signature was obtained under duress, and he was required to assume the title of regent to commit the monarchy. The new Council of 36 was installed, but the ousted councillors fled to Bordeaux to inform King Jean. Just before he was captured and taken to London, King Jean repudiated his son's signature and the entire ordinance. During the summer of 1357, neither the Dauphin nor the council was able to govern effectively. The Dauphin made a royal progress through the country to show that kingship was still functioning, which was more successful than Marcel's efforts. When the estates reconvened in April, it was clear that the nobility, resenting the terms of the Grand Ordinance, was withdrawing support. The reform movement was in trouble, and the breakdown of authority was reaching a catastrophic level. The catalyst for this breakdown was the brigandage of military companies, known as the Free Companies. These groups were composed of English, Welsh, and Gascons released after the Battle of Poitiers by the Black Prince, along with German mercenaries and Hainault adventurers. They had acquired a taste for the ease and riches of plunder during the prince's campaigns, and continued to operate in the area between the Seine and the Loire, and between Paris and the coast. After the Truce of Bordeaux, they were joined by the forces of Philip of Navarre, leftovers from the Duke of Lancaster's forces, and experienced Breton captains and men-at-arms, skilled in exploiting a region. These brigands would seize a castle, and use it as a stronghold from which to exact tribute from travelers and raid the countryside. They would spy out a good town, enter it by covert means, set fire to a house, and cause the townspeople to flee. Then they would break into coffers and houses, rob, and flee with their loot. They imposed ransoms on prosperous villages, burned the poor ones, and robbed abbeys and monasteries. They pillaged peasants' barns, killed and tortured those who resisted, and violated women and children. They wantonly burned harvests and farm equipment, cut down trees and vines, and destroyed what they lived by. Actions that seem inexplicable except as a fever of the time or an exaggeration of the chroniclers. Companies of this kind had existed since the 12th century, but they proliferated in Italy, where the nobility, more urban than elsewhere, left the profession of arms increasingly to mercenaries. Led by professional captains, these companies, sometimes numbering 2,000 to 3,000, were composed of exiles, outlaws, landless or bankrupt adventurers, and mercenaries from various countries. One of the most notorious captains was Fra Monreal, a renegade prior of the Knights of St. John, who maintained a council, secretaries, accountants, and a gallows. He could command a price of 150,000 gold florins from Venice to fight Milan. In 1353, he extorted 50,000 florins from Rimini, 25,000 from Florence, and 16,000 each from Pisa and Siena. Invited to Rome by the revolutionary Cola di Renzi, Monreal was seized, tried as a public robber, and executed. He went to the block magnificently dressed, and declared himself justified in his actions. The most damaging aspect of these companies was that they filled a need in the absence of organized armies, and became accepted. Philip VI, impressed by the effectiveness of a captain known as Bacon, bought his services for 20,000 crowns and made him usher at arms. Another, named Croquart, rose from a poor page to become a captain of brigands worth 40,000 crowns. His military reputation led King Jean to offer him a knighthood, a rich wife, an annual pay of 2,000 livres, but Croquart preferred his independence. The free companies in France, though primarily English, also attracted French knights who had been ruined by ransoms and now shared in the ravaging of their own country. Lesser nobles, younger sons, and bastard sons found in the companies a living, a path to fortune, and a way of life. One of the most notorious was Arnaud de Serval, a noble of Périgord known as the Archpriest, due to a clerical benefice he once held. Wounded and captured at Poitiers, he paid his ransom and returned to France in 1357, becoming commander of a band that called itself the Societe del Equisito. In collaboration with Raymond Desbox, the band grew to an army of 2,000, and Serval became one of the great evildoers of his time. In 1357, he launched a raid through Provence that made Pope Innocent VI feel so insecure in Avignon that he negotiated for immunity. Serval was invited to the papal palace, treated with reverence, and given a pardon and 40,000 écus to leave the area. Among the English, Sir Robert Knollys was a notorious figure. Known as the man of few words, he was judged by Froissart to be the most able and skillful man at arms in all the companies. Rising from the ranks in the Breton Wars, he fought with the 30 and gained knighthood. After service with Lancaster, he remained to plunder Normandy, amassing booty worth 100,000 crowns. In the next 2 years, he established himself in the Loire Valley, controlling 40 castles and leaving a trail of devastation. The fear of his name was such that people threw themselves into the river at the mere mention of his approach. Despite his activities, King Edward III pardoned Knollys and later appointed him to high command. This was the world of medieval Paris, a city where beauty and brutality coexisted, and where the struggle for power and survival was constant. The Grand Ordinance of 1357 represented a bold attempt to bring order and decency to a troubled time, but it was ultimately undone by the resistance of the nobility and the chaos unleashed by the free companies. The story of Paris in the 14th century is a tale of resilience, adaptation, and the enduring human spirit in the face of overwhelming adversity.